So imagine waking up one morning, stepping out to check on your property like you always do, and finding bright white parking lines painted all over your private field. Not just one or two, we're talking about an entire grid, like some messed up parking lot blueprint just showed up overnight. Now, here's the kicker. No warning, no permission, no explanation. Just the HOA thinking they had some sort of divine right to turn my open green space into their personal overflow parking. I'm not even part of the HOA. Never signed up, never paid dues, never agreed to anything. My property was never under their control, but that didn't stop them. And when I tried to talk to them about it, oh no, they doubled down, claimed it was for community convenience, and said I should be more neighborly. One of the board members even had the nerve to say I should be grateful because it raised property value. At this point, I was past mad. I was insulted, but I didn't react how they expected. I kept calm, smiled, and waited, because I knew their next HOA meeting was coming up, and they were planning to hold it right there in the community clubhouse, which just so happens to get its electricity from my land. Let's just say things got real quiet, real fast. In this story, you're going to see exactly how I turned the tables. We're talking about boundary-pushing HOA drama entitled board members, and the moment their smug expressions froze in the dark. If you've ever had to deal with nosy neighborhood committees or people who think rules don't apply to them, you're going to want to stick around, because what happened next? Let's just say it didn't go the way the HOA expected. Now, to really understand how things spiraled into that chaotic meeting blackout, you've got to know a bit more about this HOA and how they operate. See, our neighborhood's kind of a mix. Some homes are under the HOA and some aren't. Mine? Definitely not. I bought this land years ago, long before their committee even existed. But once they formed, it was like they couldn't stand the idea of anyone not playing by their little rulebook. They tried subtle things at first, letters in the mailbox, a guy knocking at my door asking if I'd like to voluntarily join for the good of the community. I always politely declined. Still, they kept pushing. What really lit the fuse, though, was when a few neighbors started using my field to park during their block parties. At first, I didn't mind. I'm not unreasonable. But then it became routine. No one asked anymore. People just assumed they had a right. Then, boom, those white parking lines showed up, like it was official or something. That's when I knew the HOA had gone too far. I found out later they'd voted to expand parking access, decided my field was the perfect solution, even though it's clearly outside their jurisdiction. One of their board members, Susan, is especially pushy. She acts like the queen of the cul-de-sac, always holding that little clipboard, taking photos of people's lawns, sending warning letters if your trash bins are out a minute too long. She was leading the charge on this whole parking thing, and when I confronted her, she just smirked and said, "It's already done." That smug attitude stuck with me. So I started doing some digging, and that's when I found out the power lines for the community clubhouse. They cross right over my land, and they never got permission. That changed everything. So once I realized those power lines crossed into my property without any kind of written agreement or easement, I knew I wasn't just dealing with entitlement, I was dealing with carelessness. I started digging through my property records and old surveys, just to be sure. And yeah, the utility path was clear as day. The HOA had been drawing power through my land for years. No one ever asked. No one ever paid. They probably just assumed no one would notice. That's when the dynamic shifted in my head. This wasn't just about painted parking lines anymore. It was about people thinking they could do whatever they wanted because no one had stopped them. Before, it wasn't just Susan either. A few other board members, like Greg and Linda, were quietly backing her up. Greg's the kind of guy who always smiles at you, but then sends a complaint about your fence height behind your back. And Linda? She's been trying to get me to donate part of my land for a dog park for over a year now. Suddenly, it made sense. They weren't just acting for the neighborhood. They were carving out personal conveniences and pretending it was all for the greater good. I stayed quiet, kept things friendly. But I started watching. I made note of when the clubhouse lights turned on. I tracked how often they used the place. I even noticed they'd scheduled their big quarterly HOA meeting on a Saturday evening, which meant it would be packed with guests, speakers, and probably even catered snacks. Perfect. Meanwhile, neighbors started whispering. A few people were on my side, quietly annoyed by the HOA's overreach, but too afraid to speak up. One guy, James, told me his wife got a violation notice because their Halloween decorations were too aggressive. Another woman got fined for having a flower pot on her porch railing. It was clear this HOA wasn't about community. It was about control. And they'd just picked the wrong person to push. The day of the HOA meeting finally rolled around, and by that point, I had every detail planned. I wasn't looking for a fight, and I wasn't interested in shouting matches. I just wanted them to understand that crossing lines literal and legal comes with consequences. The clubhouse was buzzing with activity by late afternoon. Cars started pulling into my field again, this time lining up neatly inside those painted slots like they belonged there. It was surreal watching it all happen, knowing they had no clue what was coming. Inside the clubhouse, you could hear the echo of voices through the open windows, Susan doing her usual power talk, Greg handing out printed agendas, Linda setting up chairs like she was hosting a royal event. They were all so confident, so secure in the idea that they were untouchable. The irony was almost too good. I waited just outside the property line where the utility box sits. It wasn't locked. No signs, no warnings. Just tucked away behind some bushes like it had been forgotten. All I had to do was flip one switch to cut off the clubhouse's power and with it, the entire HOA meeting. But I didn't do it right away. I stood there for a minute, heart pounding. I kept thinking about how long they'd been walking over people, how often they used rules as weapons. And now, for once, the rules weren't on their side. I glanced back at the field, now full of SUVs and sedans, some parked halfway onto my grass. It wasn't about revenge. It was about setting things straight. But still, part of me wanted to hear Susan's voice just once more, mid-sentence, when the lights and mic cut out and reality finally caught up to them. So I waited for just the right moment. Let them settle in. Let the meeting begin. And when the room was full, and Susan tapped the mic to call things to order. Susan tapped the mic once, twice. A screech echoed from the speakers, and everyone inside went quiet as she cleared her throat and launched into her usual greeting. That was the cue. I reached out toward the breaker, fingers brushing the switch, ready to flip the silence over their arrogance. But then, just before I touched it, my phone buzzed. A message from James, the neighbor, who'd been quietly backing me. All it said was, "Don't do anything yet. You need to see this." Confused, I pulled back and stepped away from the box. A minute later, James came jogging around the side of the clubhouse, his face flushed. He pulled me aside and handed me his phone. On the screen was a scanned document and email thread, accidentally forwarded to him by someone on the HOA mailing list. What I saw made my jaw clench. Turns out, the parking lines weren't just for temporary use or community convenience like they claimed. They were planning to lease the field to an event company for weekend parking during farmers markets and festivals for profit. They were going to make money off my land, and it got worse. There were already early drafts of a claim being filed to try and absorb my land under a community easement clause. Susan, Greg, and Linda were spearheading it, quietly setting things in motion behind closed doors. The painted lines, though wasn't overreach, was the start of a land grab that changed everything. This wasn't just about some HOA power trip anymore. It was about property rights, deceit, and a coordinated attempt to take something that didn't belong to them. I felt a pit form in my stomach. I'd been ready to shut off their power to make a point. Now, that wasn't enough. I looked back. At the clubhouse, lights glowing, people chatting, completely unaware that their little scheme was no longer secret. The question now wasn't if I was going to act it, was how far I'd have to go to stop them. I stared at the clubhouse, heart racing, mind spinning. They weren't just entitled, they were sneaky. And now, with James's message fresh in my head, I knew I couldn't let this slide. I needed more than a blackout. I needed proof, something undeniable that showed their real intentions before they could twist the story. So I held off flipping that switch and walked straight into the meeting, right through the side entrance. Heads turned as I stepped inside, but Susan kept talking. Clearly caught off guard, but trying to hold her ground, I raised my hand, calm, steady. "Sorry to interrupt," I said loud enough for the mic to pick up. "But since you're discussing community matters, I thought you'd all want to see something." Before she could stop me, I connected my phone to the HDMI cable at the side of the projector. One click and boom, James's screenshots of the emails, the drafted lease agreements, the fake easement plans, all up on the big screen in front. Of the entire room, the silence that followed was unlike anything I've heard. You could feel the shift, like the floor had dropped out from under them. Susan's face drained of color. Greg started stammering something about context, and Linda straight up walked out. The audience neighbors who had blindly followed them for years just stared. Someone actually gasped when they saw the draft lease's dollar amounts. That moment, that was the real power cut. Their control snapped. But here's the twist. As the room erupted with questions and accusations, one older man stood up. I'd never seen him before, but he introduced himself as a retired real estate attorney and my new best friend, apparently. He confirmed out loud, in front of everyone, that the HOA had no legal claim to my land. In fact, they might be facing serious consequences for trespassing and misuse. Just when I thought it was all over, he leaned in and said, "You should probably check your title documents. That utility line they're using. I think you've got more leverage than you realize." After that night, everything changed. The HOA didn't just lose face, they lost trust. Several neighbors resigned from the board within days. Susan, Greg, and Linda tried to spin the story, but it was too late. The evidence was clear, and people were done being quiet. The retired attorney, who turned out to live just 2 streets over, helped me file a formal cease and desist against the HOA for unauthorized use of my land and utilities. He also helped review my title, and sure enough, I owned the ground beneath those power lines and had every legal right to revoke access. Instead of flipping a switch in secret, I submitted an official notice. The clubhouse power would be disconnected in 14 days unless they removed the parking lines, apologized publicly, and agreed in writing to stay off my property. That got their attention. Fast. Within a week, the lines were scrubbed off and a very awkward community email went out with a half-hearted apology. It wasn't perfect, but it was a win. Even better, a new group of residents stepped up to reform the HOA people who actually believed in fairness and communication, not control. As for me, I planted a wildflower garden where those parking lines used to be. No more tire marks, just peace. This story wasn't just about one field or one HOA. It was about standing up when people overstep. It was about knowing your rights, trusting your gut, and not letting quiet pressure turn into loud control. If you've ever dealt with entitled people or shady HOA tactics, you know how exhausting it can be. But sometimes, all it takes is one. Well-timed, move on to the right people at your side to flip the story completely. And in this case, no power switch needed.